Let's break down 4 running backs and 4 wide receivers that are going to absolutely dominate Week 10 of 2024 fantasy football. These players have way too much upside. Their matchups are way too good for you guys to leave them on your bench. These are 8 players that are going nuclear in Week 10 of 2024 fantasy football. Let's kick the video off with Tyrone Tracy of the New York Giants, who has the best possible matchup you could literally ask for here in Week 10, going up against the Carolina Panthers, still giving up the most fantasy points to the running back position so far on the season. This run defense has been absolutely abysmal all season long. We have to starting running backs against this Carolina Panthers unit. And I know that Tracy was one of my must-start players last week against the Washington Commanders after he was cleared from concussion protocol, and he walked away with just 7.9 fantasy points. Definitely disappointing, but he was still efficient on the ground, 4.13 yards per carry, 1 catch, just didn't find the end zone, unfortunately. And ultimately, this week, I feel much better about things. We go back the past couple weeks, 23 fantasy points, 145 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 2 receptions in Week 8. Week 6, 22.7 fantasy points, 50 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 6 receptions, and 57 receiving yards. Then in Week 5, when he really was starting to get those opportunities, 14 fantasy points, 129 yards on the ground, 7.17 yards per carry, as well as 7.25 yards per carry in Week 8. So for the most part, has really done the most with the opportunities that he's gotten. Just a bit of a down week, but if you own him, do not bench him this week. He's going to bounce back in big fashion in that early morning game on Sunday against the Panthers. There is no way that you can bench Tyrone Tracy here in Week 10. My favorite line so far on Underdog this week is Tyrone Tracy's rushing yards sit at 70.5. I am sprinting to Underdog to take the over on Tracy's rushing yards. All new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, are getting a free NFL Pick Em for Week 10. Take your free Pick Em. Take the over on Tracy's rushing yards. Once those both hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with that promo code, TheCatch, a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em for the week that you can pair with Tyrone Tracy's literally almost free line against the Panthers and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Moving along, let's take a look at DeAndre Swift, who made last week's video and overall was one of my must-start players of the week. Talked about him again on Sunday morning. Felt very confident about Swift going up against the Cardinals, who were ranking very low against the position, and they held their own against DeAndre Swift and company, but Swift still had a good game. 14.2 fantasy points, 51 yards on the ground, 6 catches for 31 receiving yards. So that receiving work really saved his fantasy stat line. But this week he gets the New England Patriots, now giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the running back position. And I'm already getting questions about Swift being in and out of lineups this week. There's no way we're benching DeAndre Swift. He still has double digits in every game since week 4. He just faced some really weak defenses early on, weeks 5, Carolina, week 6, the Jacksonville Jaguars had a monster game against the Rams, who were ranking much lower against the run back in week 4 than they are now here in week 10. And he had that big touchdown run against the Commanders in week 8. So given that he didn't have a big explosive play, didn't score a touchdown in week 9, but still walked away with 14.2 fantasy points, you should be feeling very optimistic, very good about DeAndre Swift this week against the Patriots at home to have a big explosive play or score a touchdown and overall have a good fantasy day. Don't forget the Bears coming out of the bye week. We're on the road for 2 straight games. Their offense has not looked good. I understand that, but this is a much better overall matchup here against the Patriots in week 10. I would make sure DeAndre Swift is in your starting lineups no matter what. Next up, we have Aaron Jones of the Minnesota Vikings, and I will let you guys know we're going to talk about this matchup between the Vikings and the Jaguars a few times throughout the video. But Aaron Jones, the past 2 weeks, still your RB18 on the season, still averaging 15.4 fantasy points per game, but the ceiling's been a little bit lower. Still has been good, but 12.2 fantasy points in week 9, 11.5 fantasy points in week 8. Kind of missing that higher ceiling that we saw basically between weeks 1 and 7 outside of 2 outlier games against the Niners and the Jets, but between 17.9 fantasy points and 25.8 fantasy points in 4 of those 6 matchups. So overall, Aaron Jones has been fantastic on the season. No reason that you really should consider benching him, but if you're looking at other options on your roster, don't do it, as the Jaguars are giving up the 28th most fantasy points to the running back position. They have just been getting absolutely shredded all season long, not just by running backs, but overall against almost every single position. But they're coming off a game where Saquon Barkley just absolutely embarrassed them. Looked like a Madden player with someone holding a controller against that defense. And nonetheless, while Aaron Jones might not be Saquon Barkley, he has still been fantastic on the season, and I'm expecting a big offensive performance out of the Vikings in general. Should be a big ceiling, high upside day for Aaron Jones in week 10. Make sure he is in your starting lineup. Last running back that I want to talk about is J.K. Dobbins of the LA Chargers, coming off of a performance where he had 24.5 fantasy points against that Browns defense on the road, 85 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, and added 2 receptions for 20 receiving yards. This Tennessee Titans defense, their run defense specifically, has really started to fall back in rankings. They still rank pretty high against wide receivers, quarterbacks, but they've started to really struggle against opposing running backs. They're coming off of a performance where Ramondre Stevenson, in a game where Drake May was quarterback, and I think throwing the football was the first and foremost thing for the Patriots, Ramondre Stevenson still came out of that game with 22.4 fantasy points. They still played pretty well against Ramondre on the ground, don't get me wrong, just 16 yards allowed, but he did have a rushing touchdown, and he added 5 receptions for 38 receiving yards and a touchdown and 22.4 fantasy points. So this defense will allow for running backs to catch the football and to score. Dobbins coming off of his best fantasy performance of the season so far. This is a run-first offense. He's averaging 16.2 fantasy points per game. He's the RB13 on the season. The floor is safe. The upside is there. The matchup is there. There's no reason to bench J.K. Dobbins this week. He's an excellent flex play. You can roll with him as your RB2. Overall, this Chargers offense starting to roll a little bit here, starting to look a little bit more fluent. They're throwing the football. You're getting Quentin Johnson involved. We've seen that big game out of Ladd McConkey. He had a good game this past week as well. Josh Palmer's getting involved. Will Dissly is a tight end that can play football, right? This offense with Justin Herbert is looking a lot better. That's going to mean more red zone opportunities, more potential touchdowns for J.K. Dobbins. He should be in your starting lineup against the Titans at home here in week 10. Moving along to wide receiver, let's start with DeVonta Smith, a player I have highly encouraged you guys to absolutely not bench. I mean, basically all season, but especially in the last 2 weeks after that dud performance in week 7 with 0.8 fantasy points against the Giants. And this was my top buy low option after week 7 of 2024 fantasy football. This is the DeVonta Smith experience. He has that goose egg game once a year. I don't know what it is, but it happens. Nonetheless, he has been an absolute stud since week 7. 20.5 fantasy points in week 8, 85 receiving yards, a touchdown, 18.7 fantasy points this past week against the Jags. He was in last week's must-start video. 4 receptions, 87 receiving yards, and that incredible touchdown catch. Now, going into week 10, we've got A.J. Brown a little bit banged up. He's considered day-to-day. He may or may not play. If he doesn't play, I think that's good for DeVonta Smith, more volume. If he does play, I think that's good for DeVonta Smith. Less defensive pressure, as the Cowboys' awful defense will now have to also apply defensive pressure to A.J. Brown and account for him. So DeVonta Smith, no matter what, sometimes I just get this weird feedback on a regular basis about DeVonta Smith. Like, should I start this guy over Smith? Should Smith be in my flex? Should he be my wide receiver too? DeVonta Smith should always be in your starting lineup. He's one of the most consistent players in fantasy football, ranking as a top 20 fantasy wide receiver now 3 years in a row. I know we still have plenty of season to go, but he's a model of consistency. I know the goose egg game shows up, but most wide receivers have inconsistency. And for the most part, DeVonta Smith is actually very, very consistent. This is a great matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. This team offensively, defensively, and complete shambles. If the Eagles come into Dallas and embarrass them, their season might just be completely scrapped, right? And it's already looking very close to completely scrapped. And bear in mind the Eagles' upcoming schedule for wide receivers. Dallas this week, the Commanders, who maybe with Marshawn Lattimore and the improvements that they've made, we may not want to sneeze at them. But then the Rams, the Ravens, the Panthers, the Steelers, Commanders again, and then the Cowboys. Overall, a very strong strength of schedule. So there's no reason here in week 10 that you should bench DeVonta Smith. And overall, moving forward, DeVonta Smith is in your starting lineups no matter what, unless we see an injury. Guess what? I'm heading straight to Underdog to take DeVonta Smith to score a touchdown this week. He now has a touchdown in 3 of his last 4 starts. He now has a touchdown in every game he's played in since week 2, except for week 3 against the Saints and except for that dud game against the Giants. So I'll take him again here in week 10, especially if A.J. Brown misses this game, to score a touchdown. Don't forget, use that link down below. Get your free NFL Pick Em for the week. Pair it with DeVonta Smith to score a touchdown. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you guys sign up with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you that 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Let's circle back to that Minnesota matchup with the Jaguars, and let's talk about Brian Thomas Jr. coming off of a poor fantasy performance this past week with 6.2 fantasy points, 4 targets, 2 grabs, 22 receiving yards, and a good matchup against the Eagles. But similar to the Commanders, who we just mentioned, this Eagles defense also rapidly improving. These might not be 2 secondaries we can just start whoever against every single week. But Brian Thomas is not just whoever. And throughout the course of the season, I've told you guys, start Brian Thomas Jr. basically no matter what since week 1. Didn't pay off in week 6 in a tough matchup. Didn't pay off this past week. But here in week 10 at home, we get the Minnesota Vikings, who they game planned very well against the Colts and company last week. Still gave up on average 12 fantasy points to Josh Downs. So I feel like the floor is safe for Brian Thomas Jr. this week, but the upside is still there. We've seen, performances of 21 plus fantasy points 3 times since week 4 for Brian Thomas. I think he can absolutely get to that mark here in week 10. The game script should be good here. Yes, the Jags defense is awful, but that allows for good game scripts. That's good for fantasy. That means that they have to throw the football. So Brian Thomas, don't forget, he's your wide receiver 6 so far on the season. He's got some nice upcoming matchups. Minnesota this week, the Lions in week 11, bye week 12, but then the Texans in week 13. There's really no reason to consider benching Brian Thomas Jr. I know he's coming off of a bad performance. That just means he has all the reason in the world to bounce back this week. Don't forget, he's averaging 14.4 fantasy points per game. Like I said, he's the wide receiver 6. The Vikings giving up the 31st most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Brian Thomas Jr. stays in your starting lineups. He could go absolutely nuclear here in week 10. Let's stick with a wide receiver on the opposing team in that matchup. And no, I'm not talking about Justin Jefferson. Let's talk about Jordan Addison, coming off of a great game against the Indianapolis Colts in week 9. 16.1 fantasy points, 5 targets, 5 grabs, 42 receiving yards, and a touchdown. The Vikings, coming off of those 2 straight losses, they got to get a guy like Jordan Addison involved in this past game. We got a great running back in Aaron Jones. We got arguably the best wide receiver in the entire league in Justin Jefferson. But you got a great complementary piece in Jordan Addison. We now got TJ Hawkinson back and healthy, who also has a great matchup in this game. But we got to get those guys like Hawkinson and Addison going and show why this passing game for the Vikings can look dominant just like it did very early in the season. The guy like Jalen Naylor balling out. So Addison, very nice to see him involved after 3 straight games of 9.6 or less fantasy points. Don't forget, in week 4, he had 22.9 fantasy points against the Packers. Super soft matchup against this Jaguars team that has struggled overall defensively, but has especially struggled in their secondary. There's no reason why Addison should not be part of the game plan. And once again, I'm expecting a good game script in this game. I think the Jags will push back a little bit in this game and keep themselves in the mix, which will force the Vikings to continue to rack up some points in this game. It's also a road game, so that could make things a little bit more competitive here for the Vikings. Overall, Addison has still averaged double-digit fantasy points so far on the season per game at 11 fantasy points per game. It's kind of like just one of these guys who might be hanging out on your bench, might be in your flex here and there. I think he's a solid flex option here in Week 10. We don't want to ignore this matchup against the Jaguars. Everyone on the Vikings offense this week is a strong start. JJ, Addison, Jones, Hawkinson. Get these guys in your starting lineups. They're going to have a big week on the road against the Jacksonville Jaguars. All right, and we had to put somebody a little risky on here, so let's talk about Jameson Williams against the Houston Texans, making his return from that 2-game suspension. This is what I'm going to say, okay? Last week, I told you guys, under no circumstances do we bench Garrett Wilson in the must-start video, because this Houston Texans secondary is that bad. And we saw a double-digit fantasy performance to Davante Adams and to Garrett Wilson, and Garrett Wilson had one of his best games of his entire career. So there's plenty of room here for both Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams to have a big game this week on the road on Sunday Night Football in prime time in a big matchup against the Houston Texans. We should expect points in this matchup. We should expect a competitive game script. We got 2 of the best teams in the NFL. I know the Texans have looked bad, but they're atop of that division. They've only lost 3 games on the season. Then we got the Lions, arguably the best team in the entire NFL. Sunday Night Football, this is what the NFL is looking for, right? But don't forget, going into week 7, Jameson Williams was the wide receiver 15 in fantasy football. He had 14.4 or more fantasy points in every game except for week 3 against the Arizona Cardinals. The volume wasn't great in all those games, but the Lions were finding ways to get him the football and finding ways to have him make those big, explosive plays. And I guarantee you, while everyone's sleeping on J-Mo, going into week 10, Dan Campbell, Ben Johnson, these guys are going to draw something up for a big play against this abysmal Houston Texans secondary for Jameson Williams. So I love the upside here. I love the matchup. I think he's a little bit sneaky, which I always like. People are kind of frowning on him. People have dropped him in leagues. I think that's crazy. He is a strong start here in week 10. Plenty of upside. Great matchup. Still averaging 12.4 fantasy points per game. I think Jameson Williams could go absolutely nuclear here in week 10. That'll do it for today's video. There are 8 must-start players for week 10 of 2024 fantasy football. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, drop me a comment. I'll make sure to clear all comments before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. And on top of that, guys, we're going to have everything here on the channel throughout the week that you guys could possibly need for week 10 of 2024 fantasy football. Start sits at every position, kicker rankings, must-start defenses, trade targets, last-minute waiver additions, fantasy Q&A, live streams, everything that you guys could possibly need to dominate week 10 of fantasy football. So most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.